We'll go ahead and call this the hearing to order. And we've got a series of votes that are coming up right away, so I thought we'd try to get through opening statements, and then we'll come back and jump right into amendment debate. But I'd like to thank everybody for being here. Today we're going to be marking up legislation to improve the regulatory climate for American small businesses. While the economy has limped along over the past 4 years, the ability of small businesses to grow and create jobs has been hampered by ever-increasing regulatory burden. And this means small businesses have to spend more time, money, and resources just to comply with the regulations. The Regulatory Flexibility Act, or the RFA, requires all federal agencies to examine the impact of their regulations on small businesses. And if those impacts are significant, the agency is required to consider less burdensome alternatives. And although the RFA has been on the books for over 3 decades, agencies still fail to fully comply with the letter of the law. And the unfortunate result is poorly crafted regulations that unduly burden small businesses. In 1996, Congress enacted the Small Business Regulatory Enforcement Fairness Act, which amended the RFA and it added several important requirements. While these changes had a modest positive effect, hearings held by this committee on small businesses over multiple Congresses have revealed that agency compliance with the RFA is sorely deficient. And despite presidential directives, congressional oversight, court admonishments, and small business pleas, agencies still continue to ignore the RFA. However, congressional support for improving and strengthening the RFA continues to grow. And in the 112th Congress, the Regulatory Flexibility Improvements Act of 2011 passed the House by a bipartisan vote following passage by voice vote in this committee. The bill being considered today, which is H.R. 2542, the Regulatory Flexibility Improvements Act of 2013, is virtually identical to the bill passed at the end of 2011, and it includes the 4 Democrat amendments the committee adopted in the last Congress. The bill will ensure that agencies genuinely scrutinize the impacts of their actions on small businesses by requiring them to look at both direct and indirect effects, closing loopholes that the IRS exploits, and requiring all agencies to convene small business advocacy review panels for certain rules, and it eliminates barriers to judicial review, among other very important provisions. It has the support of the small business community and members from both sides of the aisle, and I'd urge my colleagues to support the legislation. And I now recognize Ranking Member Velasquez for her opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think all members of this committee recognize the importance of having a regulatory process that works. Ultimately, regulations play a critical role in protecting the health and safety of the American people. Ensuring our water is safe to drink, workers are protected from hazards, and that consumers are not cheated requires effective and well-thought-out regulations. At the same time, we must balance achieving this goal against having overly broad regulations that unfairly and unnecessarily penalize our small businesses. How we craft a regulatory system that achieves this goal is certainly an important topic for debate. When I chaired the committee, we were certainly open to having that discussion. We all have different perspectives on how to get there. But we also agreed that we want a regulatory structure that works for entrepreneurs and the public. The committee passed very similar legislation to the bill we are contemplating today last Congress. Since then, there have been a number of critical changes that I do not believe are accurately reflected in the bill before us. At the outset, this measure does not take into account recent implementation of the President's executive order on regulations. That effort has been recognized in the small business community, among industry groups, and in government as having significantly improved how the agencies develop and implement regulations. Given the important strides that the administration has made in implementing the executive order, there are serious concerns that this bill will, at best, duplicate those efforts. At worst, it could complicate or slow implementation of the order. Equally important, this bill has not been adjusted to reflect the realities we face due to sequestration. The fact is that adding additional bureaucrats to perform yet more work in tinkering with and altering regulations will cost money. That is money we simply do not have. In this fiscally constrained era, tough choices need to be made about how to preserve existing programs and ensure the taxpayer get the best bang for their buck. With this bill's $100 million price tag over a 5-year period, I question the wisdom of spending scarce resources to impede the federal process. I believe that money could be better spent on restoring funding for the SBA initiatives that have a proven record on helping small businesses create jobs. Beyond these two most recent developments, the President's executive order and the strains from sequestration, there are concerns about whether the bill will have the intended effect. Expanding the panel review process from 3 agencies to the entirety of the federal government raises serious concerns. Congress specifically chose the EPA, OSHA, and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau to be covered by panel review because of how directly the rules impact small firms. However, extending this process to other agencies will not mean less regulation. It will mean more complicated regulations. As these agencies carve out caveats and exceptions with every rule they formulate, the process will only become more confusing for entrepreneurs. Unlike their large corporate counterparts, small firms do not have legal departments to come through regulations and analyze every nuance. When we previously examined this legislation last year, one member of this committee said their goal wasn't to reform the regulatory process, but to grind it to a halt. We should be clear, this legislation will not accomplish that goal. What it will do is make the process more confusing and difficult for small companies to comply. I will also note that this year's bill includes a controversial plan to involve the SBA's Office of Advocacy in setting size standards that determine whether a company is considered small. The Office of Advocacy is a poor fit for this responsibility, and in fact, tasking them with this work will only serve to duplicate functions already performed elsewhere at SBA. Given that all agencies have tight resources, it makes little sense to add this responsibility to advocacy's portfolio. These are some of the reasons that the former SBA Chief Counsel for Advocacy under President Reagan testified before this committee against such a move. Mr. Chairman, all of us want a regulatory process that works. While I stand ready to work with the majority on improving our regulatory structure, this bill may actually do more harm than good. I hope going forward we can work together in improving the regulatory process on behalf of our nation's small businesses. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Are there any other members who wish to be recognized for the purpose of making an opening statement? Seeing none, the committee now moves to consideration of H.R. 2542, which the clerk will please report the title of the bill.
H.R. 2542, to amend Chapter 6 of Title 5, United States Code, commonly known as the Regulatory Flexibility Act, to ensure complete analysis of potential impacts on the small entities of rules and for other purposes.
And with that, since we've got a vote, I understand. We'll consider that the bill 2542 is considered read, and it will be open for amendment. What we're going to do, we've got 13 amendments, actually 19 amendments at this point, and we're going to start off. We're just going to take them in order of the way they were introduced. So, Mr. Holzkamp, you're going to be first, and when we come back, we will pick them up. And then we've got 3 from Mang, 2 from Barber, 1 from Hahn, 2 from Chu, Tipton, Schrader, Clark, Murphy, Schweikert, Payne, and Velazquez, and then anything after that that's introduced. And we'll do that just as soon as we come back. So with that, we will recess until right after this vote.
3 votes.
We'll go ahead and bring the hearing back to order. And H.R. 2542 is now open for amendment, and we'll start off with amendment number 1. Mr. Holzkamp, be recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do have an amendment at the desk, amendment number 1. I ask unanimous consent it be considered as read.
Without objection, so we're, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I certainly don't need that much time, but I am pleased that we are marking up this bill to increase accountability for federal regulatory actions that impact small business. And in my opinion, when Washington gives us a regulation telling a magician he needs to have a disaster response plan for his one rabbit, it's clear the federal government has some explaining to do, and this is actually a very simple amendment which gives small entities the ability to have access to small business panel reports as well as the supporting information upon request and in a timely fashion. Specifically, it would require the production of this information within 10 business days, and of course it enforces current laws to guard against the disclosure of trade secrets or other protected information. I have personally long been a proponent of increasing transparency in government, and when it comes to regulations that will impact small business owners who can least afford the compliance cost and who cannot afford to hire lobbyists to work on their behalf in this town, holding government accountable in the regulatory process is even more important. This amendment makes clear that we want this information to be made available and in a timely fashion. The message to the agencies is clear: be prepared to disclose what you took under consideration when deciding to propose a regulation and how you arrived at your decision. So, very simple amendment, Mr. Chairman. I urge its adoption and yield back the balance of my time.
Does any other person wish to be heard on the amendment?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, despite the gentleman's rabbit comment, I think his amendment is a straightforward, sensible amendment, and I will support it.
Anyone else wish? Does anyone else wish to be heard on the amendment? Seeing none, I do think the amendment provides for increased transparency in the process, and I appreciate the gentleman's amendment, in which I do support it as well. So the question is on the amendment offered by Mr. Holzkamp, which is amendment number 1. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed, no. The opinion of the chair is the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Next amendment is Ms. Meng.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment would provide that if the head of an agency or department certifies that the time it would take to comply with the requirements of this act, that it would cause a delay in the implementation of a rule which would result in a significant increase in the likelihood that children would be harmed, then such agency or department does not have to meet the requirements of this act as it pertains to such rule. And the concept is basic, that protecting our children is always important, and our children's safety and health should not ever be second to any bottom line of businesses. Thank you.
Does any other member wish to be heard on the amendment?
Mr. Chairman. Barber.
Mr. Barber.
I'd like to speak in support of this amendment. I think it makes a lot of sense. You know, I worked in my early life before I came to this body and before I worked for Congresswoman Giffords with children's welfare issues, and I would agree with the good lady that we need to make sure that children are never put at risk. And I would ask if she'd be agreeable to let me be a co-sponsor of her amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Does any other member wish to be heard on the amendment? Seeing none with that, I have to oppose the amendment for the simple reason that any rule that does need to be implemented for the protection of children, it can be done without having to comply with the RFA because you can use the good cause exemptions that are in the Administrative Procedure Act. It would also create some problems, too, in that agencies would have to deal with 2 different versions of the Regulatory Flexibility Act, which I do think is unworkable. So with that, I do oppose the amendment.
Mr. Chairman, I support Ms. Meng's amendment, and there is nothing more important than protecting our children. whether it be from violence in our communities to toxic substances in our air and water. An important safeguard in many of these areas are federal agencies which issues rules and regulations that protect so many of our children, whether it is reducing the prevalence of lead poisoning, ensuring that toys are not harmful, and that playgrounds are free from pollutants. Federal agencies' actions are essential to keeping our families safe. In this regard, Ms. Meng's amendment is essential to allowing agencies to continue to do their jobs, safeguarding our children. For this reason, I strongly urge members of this committee to support Ms. Meng's amendment.
And with that, again, this doesn't do anything to prevent agencies from complying, and there are exemptions for that. So with that, the question is on the amendment offered by Ms. Meng. Amendment number 1. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no.
Can I request a recorded vote, please?
A recorded vote has been requested, and pursuant to Rule 10 of the committee's rules, proceedings on the amendment will be postponed. And what we are going to do, just because I know people have commitments and stuff, we are going to postpone the recorded votes to the end and do them that way instead of creating problems or conflicts for everybody. Next amendment, Ms. Meng, your amendment number 2. Number 3, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Amendment number 3, it's her second amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment would require that the initial and final regulatory analyses include a description and estimate of the benefits also of the proposed rule to small entities. All too often, there may be benefits which would protect the health and safety of consumers or the safety of workers, and in the long term would help and increase a business's bottom line. Thank you.
Does any other members wish to be heard on the amendment? With that, I'm going to have to, again, oppose the gentlelady's amendment. I do think it's unnecessary. The Regulatory Flexibility Act is not a cost-benefit statute. It's a cost-effective statute. And it requires an agency to determine if there are less burdensome ways to achieve a regulatory objective. And so with that, the question is on the amendment offered by Ms. Meng. It's her.
Mr. Chairman, I would like to be heard on the amendment.
Sure.
Mr. Chairman, businesses across many industries rely on regulations that promote health, safety, and a clean environment. Without them, frankly, many will be unable to attract customers and employees. Small businesses want clean air, they want clean water, and they need a workforce that is healthy. It's not just the right thing to do, but it makes financial sense for businesses too. These very benefits are too often overlooked in the implementation of the RFA. Ms. Meng's amendment will change this and ensure that it's not just costs we're looking at, but also how small businesses can benefit from regulations. Doing so will ensure that we do not lose sight of the bigger issues when it comes to regulation, and I will ask the members of the committee to support Ms. Meng's amendment.
With that, again, the statute requires an agency to determine if there are just less burdensome ways to achieve whatever the objective is. With that, the question is on the amendment. Ms. Meng's amendment number 2, overall amendment number 3. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. No. It's the opinion of the chairs that the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. Chairman, and I ask for a recorded vote.
Recorded vote has been asked for pursuant to Rule 10 of the committee's rules. Proceeding on the amendment shall be postponed. With that, Ms. Meng, you have your third amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For my final amendment, which would require each agency to estimate the benefits of the proposed rule, and if they exceed the regulation's costs, then the agency would not have to convene a panel. We want to make sure that legislation passed by Congress would not decrease our nation's productivity or in any way hamper small businesses' potential for success. Thank you.
Does any other member wish to be heard on the amendment? King.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word. And I read the language in this amendment, and it occurs to me that any agency should have the responsibility to evaluate the cost-benefit of any rule that they should propose. And I would expect that's the case across all our rules and all of our agencies. And so if this amendment appears to grant the authority to waive any rule, that they might do a calculation on the cost-benefit. And I would oppose the amendment for that reason. I think it's not more than redundant. I think it inverses the rationale that we would need in order to find the streamlined rules process that we're working towards, and I yield back.
Any other member wish to be heard on the amendment? Seeing no other members wishing to be heard, I do oppose the amendment for the same reasons as the last one. The Regulatory Flexibility Act is a cost, it's not a cost-benefit bill. I think it's unnecessary, and therefore I do oppose it. With that, the question is on the amendment offered by Ms. Mang. Her third amendment. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed, no. No. It's the opinion of the chairs that the noes have it. The noes do have it. With that, our Fifth Amendment, Mr. Barber.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate this hearing and this markup. To help small businesses succeed, we must make every effort to get direct input and feedback from business owners about what's working and what's not. And that's why I meet often with business owners in my district, as others I'm sure do. And that's why I support the provision of this bill that requires a plan for outreach to gather input on existing rules from small businesses. Government should not act in isolation or in a vacuum. It must get input from the people that it affects. But hearing directly from small businesses, we can better ensure that our laws also support their growth and success. And it is especially important that we seek input on how we can better support the growing number of small businesses that are owned by women, veterans, and minorities who often face different challenges starting and growing a business. My amendment will ensure that agencies are supporting these small businesses by requiring their outreach plan to include input on existing agency rules from women, from veterans, and minority-owned businesses. I know from my own conversations with local leadership at the National Association of Women-Owned Business and the Tucson Hispanic Chamber of Commerce have helped me better understand how government can help small businesses, and that's a lesson that Federal agencies would do well to learn. This is a simple step that we can take to include the unique perspective of women, of veterans, and minority-owned business owners, and I encourage my colleagues to support this amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Does any other member wish to be heard on the amendment? With that, I think what you're trying to do, Mr. Barber, is a good thing. I think anytime we can get input from small businesses in this process, it's going to do nothing but make sure these agencies are trying to review the existing rules that are affecting them. So I support it. With that, the question is on the amendment offered by Mr. Barber, his amendment number 1. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, no. It's the opinion of the chairs that the ayes have it. The ayes do have it. With that, Mr. Barber, you have your second amendment.
Thank you again, Mr. Chairman. Again, I'm really pleased that we're marking up this bill, which I believe in the end will make government work better for small businesses. My wife and I owned a small business for 22 years, and I know from personal experience that starting a small business is not easy and that the challenges don't stop once you open your doors. We must do more to help new small businesses get started, create jobs, and grow. And so I think it's important that the Federal Government look at the economic impact that rules and regulations have not only on existing businesses, but on the prospective small business owner. This weekend, in one of the cities I represent, of Tucson, we held a startup weekend to promote resources available to new companies. And I commend the not-for-profit organization starting this event, or sponsoring this event. It's called Startup Tucson. We need to do everything we can to support these new businesses. But government should be similarly encouraging growth, not inhibiting it. And that's why I've offered this amendment that will require agencies to assess the impact of proposed rules on startup costs for small businesses. And this will help ensure that we create the very best environment to encourage and support small businesses who are local job creators. And I encourage my colleagues to support this amendment, which will help these small and new companies get going. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Does anyone else wish to be heard on the amendment? Seeing none, I think the gentleman has a good amendment. Startup costs are one of, and we've heard that in this in this committee room many times, startup costs are very, very tough, and I think anytime those can be included in this analysis, I think that's a good thing. So I do support the amendment. With that, the question is on the amendment offered by Mr. Barber. His second amendment. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. It's the opinion of the chairs that the ayes have it. The ayes do have it. Next amendment is Ms. Hahn, which is amendment number 7.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The draft bill before us aims to dramatically increase the importance of the small business advocacy review panels in the regulatory process. And while I believe it's good for the voices of small businesses to be heard, our review of proposed regulation at every level should be a discussion between the burdens and the benefits. I've always believed that you get a better result when you have all perspectives in the room. And I think it's important that in these review panels there is a person who can speak to how the proposed regulation would help them protect their health or keep them safe. So my amendment would ensure that voice is present in those discussions, simply requiring that the advocacy review panel include at least one small entity or their representative that would benefit from the regulation or whose health or safety would be protected by a proposed rule. Thank you.
Does anyone else wish to be heard on the amendment? Seeing none, I do have to oppose the amendment. Again, the Regulatory Flexibility Act is a cost-effective statute. It's not a cost-benefit statute. And the fact of the matter is, Congress or the agency has already decided that the rule is of benefit. So what they're supposed to do is make sure that it is implemented at the least cost to small businesses. Therefore, I don't think it's necessary to have a panelist defend the benefits of rulemaking. And with that, I do oppose the amendment.
Mr. Chairman,
The question is
I would
on
like
the.
to be heard.
I already asked if anyone else needed to be heard.
Well, I was
Question is on the
expecting for you
amendment
to oppose
offered
it.
by Ms. Hahn. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. No. It's the opinion of the chairs that the noes have it.
Mr. Chairman, let me just say, I totally disagree. It's outrageous that you denied me the ranking. I never did that to any Republican chairman or ranking Republican. So I just want to put them out. Well, but I was just expecting for you.
The opinion of the chairs that the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. The next amendment is Ms. Chu, her first amendment.
Yes, Mr. Chair, I have amendment number 8 at the desk. Although I commend the efforts of the Small Business Committee to ensure that agencies take into account the impact that their rules have on small businesses, I'm also concerned that this bill imposes heavy time and financial burdens on agencies, bringing the implementation of critical federal laws and policy to a halt. Agencies are already functioning with limited resources due to budget cuts and sequestration, and this bill just adds more requirements that will cost the government millions, creating an unacceptable barrier to rulemaking while potentially threatening public health and safety. My amendment would protect the federal government from the undue cost this bill could impose. If implementing this bill would disproportionately prohibit agencies from performing their statutory mission, such as ensuring that our food is safe, they would not have to comply. Agencies should always aim to consider the impact of their rules on small businesses, and many agencies are already required to do so. But we should not be preventing agencies from doing their job. I ask for the committee's support, and I yield back.
Does any other member wish to be heard on the amendment?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, otherwise I will never be heard. I rise in support of Ms. Chu's amendment. Agencies should not be unnecessarily blocked in carrying out the statutory responsibility. Ms. Chu's amendment takes the step to ensure that the panel process does not become another obstacle used to delay regulations that are in the public interest. So I urge support from the members.
Does anyone else wish to be heard on the amendment? Seeing none, I think the amendment's unnecessary. Again, agencies can avoid notice and comment rulemaking in the RFA through the good cause exemption. With that,
Mr. Chairman, I have an inquiry
Sure.
on the statement that you just made. You mentioned that the waiver, but Section 5 of the legislation that we are considering repeals Section 608 of the RFA. And that is to say that on some language of the statutory that we are discussing today is why Ms. Chu's amendment makes sense.
Well, you know, there's another reason, too, and that is the fact that the amendment would result in agencies having to comply with two very different versions of the Regulatory Flexibility Act, and I think it's unworkable from that standpoint. So with that, the question's on the amendment offered by Ms. Chu, her first amendment, which is amendment number 8. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. No. It's the opinion of the chairs that the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. Ms. Chu, your amendment number 2, which is amendment number 9.
Yes, I have amendment number 9 at the desk. I would like to offer an amendment to include trade agreements in the coverage of this bill. Since the United States is in the process of negotiating 2 major trade agreements, the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, we need to ensure that we carefully evaluate the impact of these trade agreements on small business. And that's why this amendment would allow the Small Business Administration to study the economic after effects that trade agreements have on small business. The SBA would then report their findings to Congress, giving us more information to make these important decisions. It's often said that trade agreements are a rising tide that lifts all boats because they bring economic growth and prosperity. And while a lot of boats float, some just sink. Small businesses often struggle to stay afloat because they're unable to compete with foreign goods and services. Too many have no option but to close down. It is our job as members of the Small Business Committee to ensure that small businesses are represented and protected when the U.S. negotiates trade agreements. We must protect the interests of small businesses, and that's why I'm offering this amendment. I ask for the committee's support, and I yield back.
Does any other person wish to be heard on the amendment?
I do, Mr. Chairman. Trade is critical to the growth of small businesses. 250,000 U.S. companies export to foreign markets, the large majority of them small and medium-sized enterprises that employ 500 or fewer workers. Given this critical role, we need to make sure trade agreements assist small businesses. Time and again, we have conducted several hearings in this committee about small businesses and trade agreements. And it is shown that despite the fact that 97% of all firms that are exporters, they only making revenue 30%. And so it is just logical, it's straightforward, it's common sense that we do an analysis of trade agreement of small businesses. And by the way, I just want to remind the members of this committee that in the last Congress, a similar amendment from the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Chris, was adopted to the legislation. So if it was good then, it should be good today, and I ask the members of this committee to support that amendment.
Any other members wish to be heard on the amendment? You know, I agree that as was stated, that trade is obviously very important to small business, and I would be happy to work with the gentlelady on a separate bill that would require the Small Business Administration's Office of Advocacy to do a study on the impact of those free trade agreements that we do, what that impact is going to be on small business. But I do oppose the gentlelady's amendment. There are no regulations to review when a free trade agreement is approved by Congress. Each agency has to draft and issue its own regulations after the agreement is signed. And so under H.R. 2542, all agencies that do propose significant rules are going to have to obtain pre-publication input from small businesses. Thus, it's really unnecessary. But again, I would re-offer what I had to say about looking into, you know, obviously doing a separate bill altogether on that, and you know, obviously having the Small Business Administration do a study on the impact of those free trade agreements. But with that, the question is on the amendment offered by Ms. Chu, which is amendment number 9, her second amendment. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed, no. No. It's the opinion of the chairs that the noes have it. The noes do have it. And with that, we will move on to the 10th amendment, which is...
Ask for a recorded vote.
A recorded vote has been asked for. Pursuant to Rule 10 of the committee's rules, proceedings on this amendment, they will be postponed until the very end. With that, we'll move on to amendment number 10. Mr. Tipton. Mr. Tipton, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have amendment number 10 at the desk. My amendment is a simple one that will greatly increase the transparency and will provide small businesses with a stronger voice on agency rules and regulations that are killing jobs, also driving up costs for consumers and negatively impacting the overall livelihoods of small businesses. My amendment allows for small businesses and the general public to comment on rules and regulations that they believe should be included in the periodic review of rules that Section 610 of the Regulatory Flexibility Act requires. According to the GAO, the periodic review section of RFA is one of the most consistently ignored or discarded provisions by government agencies, largely because they lack clear requirements. It only makes sense for agencies to solicit and respond to input from small businesses. This amendment makes even more sense in the context of evaluating the rules for the preset significant economic impacts as opposed to what the impact was when the rule originated. The effects of a rule or law are not static over time. Other factors such as rules, regulations, market dynamics, or fluctuations, economic booms or downturns all change to the degree to which a particular rule is affecting a small business or the business sector. And as those various factors change, a review of how they are currently affecting small businesses is just common sense. Good government necessarily requires responsiveness to the public, and it is our responsibility to ensure that an avenue to facilitate that responsiveness exists, and this amendment does just that. I would encourage the committee's support of the amendment, and with that I yield back the balance of my time.
Does any other member wish to be heard on the amendment?
I do, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, this amendment is duplicative. Executive Order 13610, issued by President Obama in 2012, already requires agencies conduct public outreach and solicit public comments regarding retrospective regulatory reviews. Creating a statutory requirement that is duplicative of current practice only creates confusion and potentially wastes taxpayers' dollars. As a result, I believe that the gentleman's amendment is unnecessary.
Does any other member wish to be heard on the amendment?
No. I do. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With respect to the ranking member's comments, actually that's the problem. We've got an executive order. This is where Congress can actually help direct what needs to be able to be done. And as is noted, this is one of the most overlooked sections in regards to actually soliciting the response. So with that, again, I ask for positive response to the amendment. I yield back.
Does anyone else wish to be heard on the amendment? With that, I do support the gentleman's amendment. It does ensure that businesses have an opportunity to comment on the list of rules that an agency is planning on reviewing as a part of its periodic review.
I have an inquiry, Mr. Chairman. Yes. Isn't this duplicative of what the executive order from the President does and requires?
Well, and as was pointed out, it is confusing, and this codifies that executive order.
Okay. So when it's duplicative on your side, it's okay, but when it's duplicative on our side, it's not.
Does anyone else wish to be heard on the amendment? Seeing none, the question is on the amendment offered by Mr. Tipton, amendment number 10. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. No. It's the opinion of the chairs that the ayes have it. The ayes do have it. The amendment is agreed to. With that, Mr. Schrader, amendment number 11. And clerk, report the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Oops, go ahead.
Let her go ahead and report it.
Amendment number 11 to H.R. 2542, offered by Mr. Schrader of Oregon. Beginning on page 26, line 4.
The objection to the amendment be considered as read. You have 5 minutes, Mr.
Great.
Schrader.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ensuring that agencies are operated in an efficient manner has never been so important. Duplication at any time is not to be, I think, tolerated in our Federal Government or any sort of governmental agency, so especially, I guess, now when we have a $16 trillion deficit. Unfortunately, Section 10 of this legislation is clearly duplication of resources. As we all know, historically, the Small Business Administrator determines the size standards for small businesses. To approve a size standard requires expertise, a little analytical resources, which the Office of Advocacy does not have and is not pertinent to their mission. This actually duplicates similar resources maintained by the SBA. I think this should be a huge red flag for us, huge red flag. And why we're creating another office to do the same thing that same office already does. This is exactly the sort of policy that makes us look ridiculous to taxpayers back home. I think for these reasons, and I remind the committee, the Chief Counsel of Advocacy under President Reagan testified before us in 2011, before this committee, that advocacy could not take on these types of responsibilities that we have outlined in this legislation. So I think we ought to think about this very, very carefully. My amendment is simple, just strikes that section, keeps all the good regulatory flexibility, strengthening in the rest of the bill. We still have the size standards. There wouldn't be affected. A small business administrator, SBA can still do that, business as usual. What it does do is just save the taxpayers a bunch of money by creating a duplicative function in the very same office. So for those reasons, I'd urge members to vote yes on this amendment.
Does any other member wish to be heard?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, historically, the SBA's Office of Size Standard has been responsible for determining what a small business is. The legislation before us changes this and moves the boxes around the SBA's organization chart for no sound policy reason. In doing so, the SBA will continue to approve size standards for its own statutes, but will no longer do so for other statutes. To me, that is ridiculous. The result of approving this legislation will be to create a duplicative size standard authority in both the SBA and the Office of Advocacy. How does this make sense? It doesn't make any sense. Such a move is curious, given the fact that the committee spends so much time convening hearings about the evils of duplication across agencies and without the SBA itself. I have to wonder if we pass this legislation today with Section 10 intact, if we will be back here eliminating it as a duplicative and wasteful program next year. Section 10 will require the Office of Advocacy to hire new personnel and conduct analysis identical to those already in existence in the SBA's Office of Size Standards. Common sense tells you that creating such similar entities is just plain unnecessary and simply irresponsible to the taxpayers. For this reason, as Mr. Schrader mentioned, President Reagan's Chief Counsel of Advocacy was here. He testified before this committee that he should not take on new responsibility outlined in Section 10. The mission of the Office of Advocacy is to be a champion for our nation's small businesses, not to determine size standards. They are not expert on this area. The SBA already does this. For this reason, I strongly urge members to vote yes on Mr. Schrader's amendment and to eliminate what will certainly be not only duplicative and wasteful taxpayer-funded boondoggle. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Anyone else wish to be heard on the amendment? With that, Section 10 of H.R. 2542 provides the Chief Counsel for Advocacy the authority to determine the size standards for purposes other than the Small Business Act and the Small Business Investment Act. The authority being transferred, it's only been used 27 times since '93, and it doesn't affect government contract or SBA loan programs in any way. It's the Chief Counsel for Advocacy, not the SBA administrator, who's charged with overseeing the RFA compliance. And with that, I oppose the gentleman's amendment. The question is on the amendment offered by Mr. Schrader, which is amendment number 11. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, no.
No.
It's the opinion of the chairs
I
that
get
the
the
noes
report?
have it. Yes.
Ask for a recorded vote, Mr.
Yes. Recorded vote has been asked for. Pursuant to Rule 10 of the committee's rules, proceeding on the amendment will be postponed. And with that, Ms. Clark, amendment number 12, and the clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 12 to H.R. 2542, offered by Ms. Clark of New
Without
York.
objection, I wish the amendment be considered as read. And with that, Ms. Clark, 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. This is a common sense emergency safeguard amendment that would allow the head of an agency or department who certifies that a specific rulemaking is necessary to safeguard the United States and its territories in regard to an act or potential act of terrorism, respond or prepare to respond to a disaster, then the agency will not have to comply with the requirements of this act. This would allow the government to be better suited to help individuals and families in need, as well as ensure that all necessary steps are taken to protect our nation and respond to natural disasters and acts of terrorism. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Does any other member wish to be heard on the amendment?
Mr. Chairman? Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, as a member of the Homeland Security Committee, I want to speak in support of this amendment. Clearly, we need to be able to move quickly without any impairment as we deal with Homeland Security and disaster relief efforts. And so I urge my colleagues to vote aye on the gentlelady's amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Anyone else wish to be heard on the amendment?
I do, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Velasquez.
Mr. Chairman, the underlying legislation repeals Section 608, which permitted agencies to waive or delay completing an initial regulatory flexibility analysis in the event of an emergency. This is why this amendment is so important. Doing so creates situations where an agency will be blocked from responding to a tragedy quickly and effectively. Disasters are all too common, and terrorism continues to be a threat. Ensuring that agencies are not unnecessarily prevented from helping our constituents or protecting the homeland in a timely manner should be a priority. For this reason, I strongly urge that the committee adopt the Clark Amendment and ensure that this legislation does not put our nation's ability to respond to disaster or the threat of terrorism at risk. With that, I encourage my members to support a sensible, common sense amendment.
Anyone else wish to be heard on the amendment? With that, any regulations, and I stated earlier, any regulations that are related to things like terrorism, particularly terrorism, they can be promulgated without having to comply with the RFA, and that's through the Administrative Procedure Act's emergency procedures, which we put in place. So with that, I think the amendment is unnecessary. With that, the question is on the amendment offered by Ms. Clark, amendment number 12. All those in favor say aye.
Aye. Aye.
All opposed, no. No. It's the opinion of the chairs that the noes have it.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
I'd like to have a recorded vote, but I'd also like to ask, is there an issue with amendments coming from this side of the aisle when they're common sense? I mean, what we're talking about here is the safety of Americans. And if we can bring clarity to that in a bill, why does that become an issue for us in a bipartisan manner? Homeland Security has always been a bipartisan issue. I'm not clear on what harm is done in accepting an amendment. Perhaps you can share that with us, Mr. Chairman.
Well, I don't think I have to answer.
But I figured I'd ask.
We've adopted 2 Democrat amendments already, and the fact of the matter is, the fact. Regardless, the question is on the amendment offered by the lady, Ms. Clark. All right, then we'll move on to the next one, and you have amendment number 13, which is your second amendment. Ms. Clark, clerk, please report the title.
Amendment number 13 to H.R. 25.
That the amendment be considered read. And with that, Ms. Clark, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The SBA Office of Advocacy is not exactly a robustly funded agency in the best of times. Considering that this legislation greatly expands their mandate without providing a corresponding increase in resources, the responsible thing is for Congress to get a quantitative understanding of advocacy's capabilities given the current budget environment. My amendment requires a GAO study within 90 days of the enactment of this legislation to determine if advocacy has the capacity and resources to effectively carry out the duties listed in the bill. This is a very straightforward, common sense amendment, and I urge my colleagues to support it. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Does anyone else wish to be heard on the amendment? Seeing none.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman. Yes, I would like to make a statement.
Velasquez.
The legislation before us requires agencies to analyze the indirect effects of proposed rules. You know, this is why we are having a markup, because the law didn't include or didn't have indirect cost. Now, that is what that amendment is adding. What is wrong with having the benefit of the full picture? This mandate will require wasteful new analysis that could be applied to virtually any action an agency attempts to undertake, no matter how unclear the connection is to small business interests. When added to the existing procedural and analytical steps that agencies must already take, the legislation will serve only to further delay rulemakings and make it nearly impossible for agencies to fulfill their mission of protecting the public. For this reason, I support Ms. Clark's amendment to strike this new requirement from the legislation.
Actually, does it strike anything?
Oh.
Does anyone else wish to be heard on the amendment? Seeing none. You're right. I support the amendment. So with that, the question is on the amendment offered by Ms. Clark, amendment number 13. All those in favor say aye. Aye.
Yeah.
All opposed, no. Opinion of the chair is that the ayes have it, and the ayes do have it. With that, amendment number 14, Ms. Clark, please report the title.
Amendment number 14 to H.R. 2542 offered.
The amendment is considered read. Gentlelady, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's difficult to see subsection B of Section 2 as anything more than an attempt to paralyze the regulatory process. The National Environmental Policy Act defines indirect effects as, quote, caused by the action and are later in time or further removed in distance, but are reasonably foreseeable, end quote. While this definition may fit the goal of maintaining a sustainable environment for future generations, we will be requiring agencies to essentially guess as to what an indirect impact is on a small entity, which itself may or may not even be subject to the regulation in the first place. Furthermore, if an agency's projections prove wrong due to the other provisions in this legislation, they could find themselves subject to litigation. I'm going to repeat that. They could find themselves subject to litigation. The fact is that agencies are already struggling to meet congressionally mandated rulemaking deadlines, in part due to budget cuts and the effects of sequester. Add to this the fact that we are creating a nearly unworkable process, which is essentially an expansion of a statutory regulatory process. And I'm left to come to the conclusion that this is nothing more than an attempt to paralyze the rulemaking process and ensure that further rulemaking is practically impossible. While this may be the intent of some, I do not operate from the premise, nor do the experiences of the small businesses in my district suggest that regulatory hurdles are amongst the most pressing issues facing our nation's small business community. So therefore, I want to urge my colleagues to support this amendment, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Does any other member wish to be heard on the amendment? Seeing none, with that, I do oppose the amendment. This is one of the key proposals in this bill, and it's one of the very loopholes that allows agencies to not comply with the RFA. And with that, I do oppose the amendment. The question is on the amendment offered by Ms. Clark, which is amendment number 14. All those in favor say aye. All opposed, no. No. It's the opinion of the chairs that the noes have it, and the noes do have it. And with that, we're on to amendment number 15. Mr. Murphy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Is at the desk. Would the clerk please report the title?
Amendment number 15, amendment
ask
to
unanimous
H.R.
consent that the bill be
2540.
read.
Absolutely. Without
Thank you.
objection. 5 minutes.
I have a simple amendment to support our nation's veterans. I strongly support the purpose of this bill, but I think we must be careful that we're not throwing obstacles in front of the already beleaguered Veterans Administration. While the VA has made some recent improvements in its capacity to serve veterans, there is still much work to be done. I expect the VA to work as expeditiously as possible to continue to streamline its processes and shorten the backlog. To this end, the VA and other agencies that serve veterans will need to revise existing rules or issue new ones. This process must not get caught up in bureaucratic red tape. I offer an amendment to exempt rules that protect the rights and benefits of veterans from being subject to the normal, time-consuming rulemaking process.
Does anyone else wish to be heard on the amendment?
Yes.
Velasquez.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, okay, Mr. Barber.
Mr. Barber.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in support of the gentleman's amendment. I have 83,000 veterans in my community, and every day, as many of us do, I hear from them about just how difficult it is to get the benefits that they are due. I would want to support any legislation or any amendment that would clear the way and expedite decision-making and regulation on their behalf. And so not only do I support the amendment, I would ask the gentleman if he would agree to let me be a co-sponsor of the amendment today.
I agree.
Ms. Velasquez.
Rise in support of the gentleman's amendment. The recent wars in Iraq and Afghanistan have resulted in millions of new veterans, many of which need our help in finding unemployment. While the unemployment rate among veterans has recently declined, veterans between the ages of 18 and 24 still have an unemployment rate of 20%. With the Afghanistan withdrawal being completed in 2014, these ranks will swell even more. We need to do everything we can to make sure veterans have the protections they need, and that means streamlining the regulatory process for pro-veterans regulations. Mr. Murphy's amendment does just that, and it is a way that we can recognize the commitment so many of these men and women have made to our country, and I urge the members of the committee to support the gentleman's amendment.
Thank you.
I yield back.
Does any other member wish to be heard on the amendment? With that, I do. I think the gentleman has a good amendment. I do support the amendment. The question is on the amendment offered by Mr. Murphy, his first, which is amendment number 15. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. The opinion of the chair is that the ayes have it, and the ayes do have it. With that, we'll move on to amendment number 16, which is Mr. Murphy's second amendment. It's at the table. Clerk, please report that time.
Amendment 16 to H.R.
I ask unanimous
2542.
consent the bill be considered read.
Without objection.
Thank you.
Mr. Murphy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This bill is similar to one that was already proposed. This amendment makes sure the Office of Advocacy has the capability to carry out the new size standard mission we are giving it. The goal of handing a piece of the size standard mission to the Office of Advocacy is to rationalize the multi-agency rulemaking process. We don't want multiple offices within the SBA working against each other. This makes sense. That's just good government. At the same time, we don't want to give a new mission to an office that may already be overburdened. We need to know whether the Office of Advocacy has the capacity to conduct this mission along with its pre-existing business. A number of my Democratic colleagues are offering amendments to address this same issue. With so many members sharing this concern, it's only reasonable that we adopt some amendment to address it. I offer an amendment requiring the Chief Counsel of the Office of Advocacy to certify that the office has the resources to carry out this mission before it is required to do so under the law. Thank you.
Does anyone else wish to be heard on the amendment?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Rise in support of the gentleman's amendment. It requires the Office of Advocacy to certify that it has the funding and personnel required to carry out its mission under Section 10. This amendment does not require an elaborate study, nor does it prohibit Section 10 from being implemented. It just asks the entity required to implement this legislation if it has enough money and staff to implement it. If the Chief Counsel simply reports and certifies to Congress on this, then Section 10 can be implemented. At a minimum, this will provide this committee with essential information regarding this new law and permit more productive oversight to occur. It also provides taxpayers with greater transparency. For this reason, I urge a yes vote.
Anyone else wish to be heard on the amendment? Seeing none, I do oppose the amendment. It allows the executive branch to basically trump the legislative branch because the executive branch is always going to say that they don't have the resources to comply. Any administration is going to do that. So with that, I do oppose the amendment. The question is on the amendment offered by Mr. Murphy, amendment number 16. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed say no. No. It's the opinion of the chair that the noes have it. With that, the noes do have it. The amendment is not agreed to. Next is amendment number 17. Mr. Schweikert is at the desk. Clerk, please report the title.
Amendment number 17 to H.R. 2542, offered by Mr. Schweikert of Arizona.
Unanimous consent that be considered as read. Schweikert.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ultimately, this is just a hyper-simple, just tightening up the definition. And with that, yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Does anyone else wish to be heard on the amendment? That is, is a very simple explanation. Anyone else wish to be heard on the amendment? That the amendment clarifies that indirect economic impacts or effects include both the compliance costs of the rules and the effects on revenue. The clarification is going to ensure that agencies' assessments of economic impacts on the RFA include effects on revenue. And I do support the amendment. With that, the question is on the amendment offered by Mr. Schweikert, amendment number 17. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. It's the opinion of the chairs that the ayes have it. And with that, the amendment is agreed to. Next is amendment number 18. Mr. Payne, it's at the desk. Clerk, please.
Amendment number 18 to H.R. 2542, offered by Mr. Payne of New Jersey.
Be considered as read. Mr. Payne.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We can all agree that small business needs to be protected against overly burdensome regulations. But as I look at H.R. 2542, it misses the mark. Instead of providing real support, H.R. 2542 offers no real assistance to small businesses, and this threatens public health and safety. Last July, the public citizens conducted a review of the public health and safety rulemaking and found that 78% of the rules analyzed missed their deadline, and more than half of them remained incomplete at that time. Most of these delays were because the regulatory process is so slow, and H.R. 2542 would further delay that regulatory process. This is a threat to the public health and safety. My amendment would prevent H.R. 2542 from being implemented until the Office of Advocacy certifies to Congress that it will not prevent agencies from taking appropriate and timely actions. This specifically speaks to the public health and safety needs, which are especially important in the face of national emergencies. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment. Thank you, sir.
Does any other member wish to be heard on the amendment? Any other member? Seeing none, there isn't anything in the RFA that prevents any agency from taking any appropriate or timely action. All this does is just require them to make sure that they take into account what the effects on small businesses are going to be. And with that, I oppose the amendment. The question is on the amendment offered by Mr. Payne, amendment number 18. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed, no. No. It's the opinion of the chair that the noes have it. The noes do have it.
Sir, I ask for a recorded vote.
A recorded vote has been asked for. Pursuant to Rule 10 of the committee's rules, proceeding on the amendment shall be postponed. And with that, Amendment 19, Ms. Velasquez.
Yes, I have an amendment at the desk.
Amendment number 19 to H.R. 2542,
Yes,
offered by
unanimous
Ms.
consent
Velasquez.
to be-
Without objection.
Thank you. In many regards, the panel process is an important means to increase small businesses' voice in the development of regulations. Currently, only 3 agencies are subject to this enhanced scrutiny: the EPA, OSHA, and the CFPB. This makes sense because these agencies are more likely to issue regulations that impact small businesses. Section 6 of the legislation before us massively expands this bureaucratic panel process government-wide, requiring more than 50 new agencies to begin to convene panels. By requiring all agencies across the government, irrespective of their budgetary resources and their impact on small businesses, this section will impose unnecessary costs on the taxpayers with limited benefit for small businesses. Instead, we should proceed slowly on the expansion of the panel process. I wholeheartedly support efforts to rein in agencies that are insensitive to small businesses, but we cannot simply flick a switch and add 50 new agencies to the panel process. To do so while ignoring the government-wide bureaucratic costs necessary to carry out this new function is irresponsible at best and foolish at worst. It must be ironic for my colleagues on the other side of the aisle that Section 6 of this bill, in its attempts to reduce federal regulation, dramatically increased the size, role, and scope of government. Getting panels up and running is costly and time-consuming. It takes funding and staff resources to develop the administrative and legal capacity to hold these panels. It requires coordination with the Office of Advocacy and the establishment of written protocols, guidance, and a public outreach mechanism. Simply put, this means just another bill for the taxpayers. But, as I mentioned, there is recognition that the panel process can produce positive outcomes for small businesses, but it has to be done in a more efficient manner. Therefore, my amendment takes a middle ground, and instead of striking Section 6 in its entirety, it proposes to phase in at the discretion of the Office of Advocacy. Based on the budgetary resources of agencies and the impact of agency rules on small businesses, the Office of Advocacy will determine a compliance schedule. This will ensure that the panel process is rolled out government-wide in a sensible manner, and that lessons can be learned and also applied during a properly paced implementation. The reality is that 4 agencies, Transportation, Homeland Security, Commerce, and EPAs, produce by far the most regulations, and it is HHS, Agriculture, and the EPA which produce the most major rules, defined as those with an economic impact of $100 million or more. Focusing on these agencies that have the most impact on small firms, as well as the budgetary resources to install a panel process, makes the most sense for businesses and taxpayers that are footing the bill. With the sequester, agencies are already trying to do more with less, and I know that members of this committee are aware of the fiscal constraint facing the U.S. government. Requiring every single agency to take on a new responsibilities, regardless of whether they provide a benefit to small businesses, as Section 6 of this bill does, is not fiscally responsible. Simply put, now is not the time to make statutory leaps when smaller steps are more appropriate. We must be mindful of the taxpayers who are footing the bill. So if you want for the IRS to immediately be brought up into the panel process, vote for this amendment. I yield back.
I can't support the gentlelady's amendment simply because it would further delay any serious agency compliance with the RFA. Agencies should have to comply with the RFA. They should have to determine, as they are supposed to, what effects their rules are going to have on small business. As simple as that. Does anyone else wish to be heard on the amendment?
Mr. Chairman, I just would like to add that why should we ask the railroad agency that doesn't issue as many regulations that have a cost impact on small businesses as the IRS, that they have to, convene panel process throughout the 50 agencies. It just doesn't make sense at a time when sequestration is impacting the budget of those agencies. And I ask for a recorded vote.
Well, I think that any agency, I don't care if they're in charge of outhouses or railroads, they should have to comply with the RFA.
Even if they don't do anything
with
against
that,
small business.
the amendment is, or a recorded vote has been asked, but we will, does anyone else wish to be heard on the amendment first? Seeing none, the question is on the amendment offered by the lady from New York. All those in favor say aye. All opposed, no. Opinion of the chair is that the noes have it. A recorded vote has been asked for. Pursuant to Rule 10 of the committee's rules, proceeding on the amendment shall be postponed. And with that, we will go back to the amendments, and we have 7 amendments that we had a recorded vote asked for. So with that, the question now occurs on agreeing to amendment number 2 by Ms. Meng, on which a recorded vote was ordered. The clerk, please call the roll.
Mr. Graves?
No.
Mr. Graves, no. Mr. Shabbat? Mr. Shabbat, no. Mr. King? Mr. King, no. Mr. Kaufman? Mr. Kaufman, yes. Mr. Lukemeyer? Mr. Lukemeyer, no. Mr. Mulvaney? Mr. Mulvaney, no. Mr. Tipton? Mr. Tipton, no. Ms. Herrera-Butler? Ms. Herrera-Butler? Mr. Hanna? Mr. Hanna, no. Mr. Huelskamp? Mr. Huelskamp, no. Mr. Schweikert? Mr. Schweikert, no. Mr. Bentivolio? Mr. Bentivolio, no. Mr. Collins? Mr. Collins, no. Mr. Rice? Mr. Rice, no. Ms. Velasquez? Yes. Ms. Velasquez, yes. Mr. Schrader? Mr. Schrader, yes. Ms. Clark? Ms. Clark, yes. Ms. Chu? Ms. Chu? Ms. Hahn? Ms. Hahn, yes. Mr. Payne? Mr. Payne, yes. Ms. Meng? Ms. Meng, yes. Mr. Schrader? Mr. Schneider, apologies. Mr. Schneider? Mr. Barber? Mr. Barber, yes. Ms. Kuster? Ms. Kuster, yes. Mr. Murphy? Mr. Murphy, yes.
Are there other members who wish to vote? See none. Clerk, please report the vote.
Yep.
11 yes, 12 no.
On this vote, there were 11 ayes and 12 noes. The amendment is not agreed to. The question now occurs on amendment number 3 by Ms. Meng, in which a recorded vote was ordered. The clerk, please call the roll.
Mr. Graves?
No.
Mr. Graves, no. Mr. Shabbat? Mr. Shabbat, no. Mr. King? Mr. King, no. Mr. Kaufman? Mr. Kaufman, no. Mr. Lukemeyer? Mr. Lukemeyer, no. Mr. Mulvaney? Mr. Mulvaney, no. Mr. Tipton? Mr. Tipton, no. Ms. Herrera-Butler? Ms. Herrera-Butler? Mr. Hanna? Mr. Hanna, no. Mr. Huelskamp? Mr. Huelskamp, no. Mr. Schweikert. Mr. Schweikert, no. Mr. Bentivolio. Mr. Bentivolio, no. Mr. Collins. Mr. Collins, no. Mr. Rice. Mr. Rice, no. Ms. Velazquez.
Yes.
Ms. Velazquez, yes. Mr. Schrader. Mr. Schrader, aye. Ms. Clark. Ms. Clark, aye. Ms. Chu. Ms. Chu. Ms. Han. Ms. Chu, aye. Oh, sorry, Han, apologies. Mr. Payne. Mr. Payne, aye. Ms. Meng. Ms. Meng, aye. Mr. Schneider. Mr. Schneider, aye. Mr. Barber. Mr. Barber, aye. Ms. Kuster. Ms. Kuster, aye. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy, aye.
Any other members wish to vote? We get everybody? Clerk, please report the vote.
Ten ayes, 13 noes.
On this vote, there were 10 ayes and 13 noes. The amendment is not agreed to. The question now occurs on amendment number 9 by Ms. Chu, which a recorded vote was ordered. Clerk, please call the roll.
Mr. Graves.
No.
Mr. Graves, no. Mr. Shabbat. Mr. Shabbat, no. Mr. King. Mr. King, no. Mr. Kaufman. Mr. Kaufman, no. Mr. Luchtemeier. Mr. Luchtemeier, no. Mr. Mulvaney. Mr. Mulvaney, no. Mr. Tipton. Mr. Tipton, no. Ms. Herrera Butler. Ms. Herrera Butler. Mr. Hanna. Mr. Hanna, no. Mr. Huelskamp. Mr. Huelskamp, no. Mr. Schweikert. Mr. Schweikert, no. Mr. Bentivolio. Mr. Bentivolio, no. Mr. Collins. Mr. Collins, no. Mr. Rice. Mr. Rice, no. Ms. Velazquez. Ms. Velazquez, aye. Mr. Schrader. Mr. Schrader, aye. Ms. Clark. Ms. Clark, aye. Ms. Chu. Ms. Chu. Ms. Han. Ms. Han, aye. Mr. Payne. Mr. Payne, aye. Ms. Meng. Ms. Meng, aye. Mr. Schneider. Mr. Schneider, aye. Mr. Barber. Mr. Barber, aye. Ms. Kust, no, he said no. Ms. Kuster. Ms. Kuster, aye. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy, aye.
Are there any other members that wish to vote? Clerk, please report the vote.
Nine aye, 14 no.
On this vote, there were 9 ayes and 14 noes. The amendment is not agreed to. The question now occurs on agreeing to amendment number 11 by Mr. Schrader, in which a recorded vote was ordered. Clerk, please call the roll.
Mr. Graves.
No.
Mr. Graves, no. Mr. Shabbat. Mr. Shabbat, no. Mr. King. Mr. King, no. Mr. Kaufman. Mr. Kaufman, no. Mr. Luchtemeier. Mr. Luchtemeier, no. Mr. Mulvaney. Mr. Mulvaney, no. Mr. Tipton. Mr. Tipton, no. Ms. Herrera Butler. Ms. Herrera Butler. Mr. Hanna. Mr. Hanna, no. Mr. Huelskamp. Mr. Huelskamp, no. Mr. Schweikert. Mr. Schweikert, no. Mr. Bentivolio. Mr. Bentivolio, no. Mr. Collins. Mr. Collins, no. Mr. Rice. Mr. Rice, no. Ms. Velazquez. Ms. Velazquez, yes. Mr. Schrader. Mr. Schrader, aye. Ms. Clark? Ms. Clark, aye. Ms. Chu? Ms. Chu? Ms. Hahn? Aye. I can't hear you. Mr. Payne? Mr. Payne, aye. Ms. Meng? Ms. Meng, aye. Mr. Schneider? Mr. Schneider, aye. Mr. Barber? Mr. Barber, aye. Ms. Kuster? Ms. Kuster, aye. Mr. Murphy? Mr. Murphy, aye.
Mr. Chair, are you recorded?
Ms. Chu, aye.
Are there any other members who wish to vote? Seeing none, the clerk, please report the vote.
Yep. 11 ayes, 13 noes.
On this vote, there are 11 ayes and 13 noes. The amendment is not agreed to. The question now occurs on agreeing to amendment number 12 by Ms. Clark, in which a recorded vote was ordered. Clerk, please call the roll.
Mr. Graves?
No.
Mr. Graves, no. Mr. Shabbat? Mr. Shabbat, no. Mr. King? Mr. King, no. Mr. Kaufman? Mr. Kaufman, no. Mr. Lukemeyer? Mr. Lukemeyer, no. Mr. Mulvaney? Mr. Mulvaney, no. Mr. Tipton? Mr. Tipton, no. Ms. Herrera Butler? Ms. Herrera Butler? Mr. Hanna? Mr. Hanna, no. Mr. Hulskamp? Mr. Hulskamp, no. Mr. Schweikert? Mr. Schweikert, no. Mr. Bentivolio? Mr. Bentivolio, no. Mr. Collins? Mr. Collins, no. Mr. Rice? Mr. Rice, no. Ms. Velasquez? Ms. Velasquez, aye. Mr. Schrader? Mr. Schrader, aye. Ms. Clark? Ms. Clark, aye. Ms. Chu? Ms. Chu, aye. Ms. Hahn? Ms. Hahn, aye. Mr. Payne? Mr. Payne, aye. Ms. Meng? Ms. Meng, aye. Mr. Schneider? Mr. Schneider, aye. Mr. Barber? Mr. Barber, aye. Ms. Kuster? Ms. Kuster, aye. Mr. Murphy? Mr. Murphy, aye.
Does any other member wish to be recorded?
13 to 11?
Seeing none, the clerk, please report the vote.
Yeah, 13 to 11. 11 yeas, 13 noes.
On this vote, there were 11 ayes and 13 noes. The amendment is not agreed to. The question now occurs on agreeing to amendment number 18 by Mr. Payne, which a recorded vote was ordered. Clerk, please call the roll.
Mr. Graves?
No.
Mr. Graves, no. Mr. Shabbat? Mr. Shabbat, no. Mr. King? Mr. King, no. Mr. Kaufman? Mr. Kaufman, no. Mr. Lukemeyer? Mr. Lukemeyer, no. Mr. Mulvaney? Mr. Mulvaney, no. Mr. Tipton? Mr. Tipton, no. Ms. Herrera Butler? Ms. Herrera Butler? Mr. Hanna? Mr. Hanna, no. Mr. Hulskamp? Mr. Hulskamp, no. Mr. Schweikert? Mr. Schweikert, no. Mr. Bentivolio? Mr. Bentivolio, no. Mr. Collins? Mr. Collins, no. Mr. Rice? Mr. Rice, no. Ms. Velasquez? Ms. Velasquez, aye. Mr. Schrader? Mr. Schrader, aye. Ms. Clark? Ms. Clark, aye. Ms. Chu? Ms. Chu, aye. Ms. Hahn? Ms. Hahn, aye. Mr. Payne? Mr. Payne, aye. Ms. Meng? Ms. Meng, aye. Mr. Schneider? Mr. Schneider, aye. Mr. Barber? Mr. Barber, no. Ms. Kuster? Ms. Kuster, aye. And Mr. Murphy? Mr. Murphy, no.
Are there any other members who wish to vote? Seeing none, the clerk shall please report the vote.
Nine ayes, 15 noes.
On this vote, there were 9 ayes, 15 noes. The amendment is not agreed to. The question now occurs on agreeing to amendment number 19 by Ms. Velazquez, on which a recorded vote was ordered. Clerk, please call the roll.
Mr. Graves?
No.
Mr. Graves, no. Mr. Shabbat? Mr. Shabbat, no. Mr. King? Mr. King, no. Mr. Kaufman? Mr. Kaufman, no. Mr. Luchtenmeyer? Mr. Luchtenmeyer, no. Mr. Mulvaney? Mr. Mulvaney, no. Mr. Tipton? Mr. Tipton, no. Ms. Herrera Butler? Ms. Herrera Butler? Mr. Hanna? Mr. Hanna, no. Mr. Huelskamp? Mr. Huelskamp, no. Mr. Schweikert? Mr. Schweikert, no. Mr. Benevolio? Mr. Benevolio, no. Mr. Collins? Mr. Collins, no. Mr. Rice? Mr. Rice, no. Ms. Velazquez? Ms. Velazquez, aye. Mr. Schrader? Mr. Schrader, aye. Ms. Clark? Ms. Clark, aye. Ms. Chu? Ms. Chu, aye. Ms. Hahn? Ms. Hahn, aye. Mr. Payne? Mr. Payne, aye. Ms. Meng? Ms. Meng, aye. Mr. Schneider? Mr. Schneider, aye. Mr. Barber? Mr. Barber, aye. Ms. Kuster? Ms. Kuster, aye. Mr. Murphy? Mr. Murphy, aye.
Are there any other members who wish to vote? Seeing none, the clerk, please report the vote.
$11 yeas, 13 noes.
On this vote, there are 11 ayes and 13 noes. The amendment is not agreed to. I'm hearing no further amendments. The question is on agreeing to H.R. 2542 as amended. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed, no. The opinion of the chairs, the ayes have it. H.R. 2542 is agreed to.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
I just want to serve notice that the Democrats will be filing our own views.
Absolutely. And without objection, a quorum being present, the bill is favorably reported to the House. And before we finish, too, I just want to say also that Ms. Herrera Butler wasn't here, and I'm sure she's laying in her room, hospital room, glued to the TV watching this hearing right now. But with that, I would like to say that the committee's thoughts and prayers are with her. But without objection, the committee staff is authorized to correct punctuation and make other necessary technical corrections and conforming changes. Seeing no objection, that's so ordered. And on that note, I want to thank the committees for their participation here today. There being no further business, the committee stands adjourned. Thanks. Any news on Jamie? What's going on lately?